If you live on Earth and are a human being, which we will assume anyone listening to this is, then you live in a society. Your society has rules and regulations. Your society has governments and bureaucracies that shape and mold it. Your society has institutions that safeguard the laws and norms of that society, be they secular, religious, or a blend of the two. You have leaders who exist in a social circle and in buildings that are more than likely untouchable to you. They may exist only on a screen or in pictures or in print for you, and it's not unlikely they will remain that way all your life. Those leaders and government officials, some of whom are part of a seemingly numberless and faceless mass, are all part of a tradition that is more than likely steeped in its own mythology of some sort, with its own monuments to past rulers and deeds of greatness or that commemorate great loss. As people who participate in the setting of the Warhammer 40,000 universe, perhaps one of the most relatable aspects of that lore is the government of the Imperium itself. But have you ever stopped to wonder if the Imperium, the High Lords of Terra, the Ordos, the Astartes, the Imperial Navy, planetary governors, the rogue traders, and the myriad of other institutions that make up the Society of Humanity of the 41st Millennium could actually function? What, if any, examples from humanity's real history can we look to and find evidence that yes, this immensely complex and in some ways almost backwards feeling society in a sci-fi setting could serve its function? Can we take the blend of quasi-feudalism and Roman provincial governance that's in the lore, leading humanity at face value as something that could function? Or as we peel back the layers, do we find that this is a part of the setting that is too hard to believe? On today's episode of Pod Save the Imperium, Adam, Danny, Tom, and myself, John, are going to look at this together. Is the Imperium of Man, as presented in the setting, a viable, or even believable, form of government, and or a structure of society? So Adam, you first. Does the Imperium actually function?
I think it actually does. The example I tend to look at is more the British Empire. After the Spanish Empire collapses and the British kind of started to take over the world, the system, especially of traveling, is similar to the way the Imperium travels in the warp, where it's long distances, many months, sometimes maybe even years, depending where they're going, especially if they're going around the world. There's a lot of travel time in between the central power of the British government giving their decree and the different colonies receiving that information, and vice versa. And the same in regards to any military campaigns. They would use indigenous populations if they could, but then they would also, send their troops out there when they actually had to enforce their will. And sometimes they got there a little too late. Sometimes they got there in time. And I think that similarity with the Imperium shows that it's something that actually could work. Maybe not as well, but I think it's something that. And the Imperium right now, anyway, has enough planets where they are going to lose some. Nothing really happened like that, as far as I can recall, with the British Empire. But unless you count the Roanoke colony.
Well, at that point, it's just it's scale, right? So if they held, in all of New England, say 40 settlements, and they lost one in the course of 100 years, then you just multiply that scale, and you could say within a reasonable margin that it's acceptable. I mean, the Imperium probably loses, of the hundreds of thousands of planets they have, they probably lose like maybe 10 on a given week. But then they also probably get like maybe 2 or 3 back and change, or they retake it. I mean, that's why there's constant.
Yeah, because they're and that's what the rogue traders are for. They're to find lost human civilizations or lost planets, and colonize new ones, which is kind of what a lot of the empires did, and not just the British, in regards to colonizing new worlds, whether it's penal legions or regiments that are no longer, or that have served their term, which the Imperium does is when the regiment serves its term, they colonize a new planet. So that's how I see it working, more or less.
So you're saying that a lore written by British people works because of British people?
Shh.
Hey, you go with what you know.
Yeah, that's fine.
I wonder how different it would have been if it was Spanish creating the game.
There'd be a lot more half Eldar running around.
Oh man! Oh god!
I was just gonna say there'd be more Rococo architecture versus heavy Gothic, but sure.
Okay,
Damn.
Danny, go ahead.
Well, it's funny because, Adams goes through history, and, I think if we look through history that the longest running continuous governments have been monarchies, right? Specifically, like the longest continuous government history is the Pandyan Empire in South India, which is 1,850 years of continuous government rule through a dynasty. And so that's the longest we've got. You look at like the British Empire, Spanish Empire, these are lasting only a couple hundred years because they collapse under the weight of the kind of conflicting cultures and ideologies that develop when you have, basically you give authority and power to regional governors like the empire, like the Imperium does, right? Where, it's the planetary governor whose kind of job is to actually kick up tithe to the Imperium, right? And they're really the only point of contact. Otherwise, each planet is run by the governor and how they choose to run. So this is, if not without a strong central figure like the emperor himself, right? Like as an actual like living higher, being, right? So I think if he had survived and was actually still around, yes, the Imperium in his vision could work where he's there, the Primarchs are there, and they're kind of running the show in this essential eternal monarchy. But in the way the Imperium is now with the High Lords of Terra and this kind of, again, hybrid colonial Roman, provincial system, it just can't work. It will eventually just start collapsing, even if there's no external threats, because it will simply become large swaths of systems will rebel, right? Because it just over enough time, culture deviates, right? Culture changes. And unless you're right there as part of the cultural kind of mimesis, it's just not going to happen, right? You're going to have distinct cultures that will eventually lead to conflict and interscene warfare.
So I actually have an interesting juxtaposition to that point, which is maybe juxtaposition is not the right word. I'm trying to come off really academic and I'm already failing, but it's the idea. I know. God, this is what happens when I drink a tall boy IPA. No, I think there's two things about Adam's comparison that are actually really poignant. Aside from, there's the whole distances thing. There's the whole, getting there in time using locals. I think there's a key point in that part of the reason that the British Empire failed over time is not simply due to its structure, but simply due to the fact that the world of humans around it evolved in culture, like you were saying, but also in technology. In the modern Imperium, right, we have two things that are very kind of what we consider the staples of the Imperium, the technology that they have and the culture that they have. So whenever I think the culture is actually really easy, you have a very oppressive regime that imposes its culture, kind of absorbs aspects of whatever the original culture was, allows some of those things to exist for the sake of transition, but overall it becomes part of the imperial cult and the imperial creed. And then additionally, you also have the fact that technology is not allowed to really progress beyond where it is. And when you have protected technology and when you have protected innovation, people aren't really allowed to innovate or explore as much as they normally would. We're kind of caught in superstition, caught in this idea of like what we're stuck behind. And then actually, I'd also add that the constant war is another reason why it works. Hilariously enough, the thing that is actually the biggest threat to the Imperium, which is the constant war, is actually the thing that kind of glues it together. Because what unifies a country among anything else other than war, right? It's we're Americans. Whenever they need to make us step in line, they just throw a war and see who shows up. But we all do. In all honesty, though, that's it, right? Like you've got a bunch of people who are surrounded by a bunch of different things, but are united by two things only: the Emperor and humanity. And then it's like, oh, there's this huge asshole over here, this monster or alien, and if you don't rally behind it, you're dead, Like, so of course, I mean, things won't progress. You never have time to progress. You don't have time to develop those poetics, right? I think Aristotle at one point said that leisure is important not only for resting and kind of recuperating, but also for development, right? That's where the arts happen, in those times of leisure, because they're works that are pursued through passion versus need. And if you think of it that way, then that's when things start to innovate, because arts get people to think and feel things that they don't normally do, or beyond what the culture allows them to, and it develops the culture, which then creates this whole.
Yeah, but there is art and stuff in the 41st millennium.
Right, but it's heavily monitored.
Yeah,
exactly.
Also, Aristotle was an asshole who was wrong about basically everything.
You're just saying that because you're biased?
I'm just saying that because dude thought slavery was fine.
Right.
His definition of slavery was not the same definition of our slavery. Okay.
Still slavery.
Still slavery.
I know. I'm not saying it was right. Just saying
whether it's chattel slavery or not is basically like, hey, so you want to kick a puppy or you want to, kick several puppies? You're still inherently kicking a puppy,
evil.
right? Like,
yeah,
you're still doing something you ought not to be doing.
I think that the weird thing about
you're just throwing ad hominems at my argument. Is all you're doing?
I mean, maybe.
That actually
the weird thing about the 41st millennium for me is that it's this weird amalgamation of so many different things, right? Like you have serfdom, but then you have a lack of technology, and it's kind of the Dark Ages, but it's also kind of the British Empire, and but there's not actually a figurehead. But then also there is. The king wasn't really that powerful in Great Britain. Parliament called a lot of the shots, right? And you have rogue traders, which are basically like the privateers, or pirates, depending on whose history book you happen to be reading at the time. And so because it's this weird type of thing, and then the planetary governors, it doesn't make any sense given the idea that they sell it as a feudal system. There's no governors in a feudal system, right? So, and you can't make a 1-for-1 comparison to a landlord from the feudal from the Middle Ages and a Roman governor. A Roman provincial governor is markedly different than Sir so-and-so who owns 50 acres of land and has 100 peasants. That's not the same thing. So the idea that they're trying to shoehorn a bunch of stuff together is kind of cool. But then the stagnation of the technology thing, like Tom was saying, I think plays a big role because in the American Revolution, our rifles being rifled helped a lot.
Hey, bro.
Compared to smoothbore muskets.
I heard
if you can just snipe out all of the people because you have a rifle that's accurate, you win, right? And then you see that kind of when you have the races that are more technologically advanced, like the Tau or the Necrons, right? They tend to beat up on the Empire a little bit more than people are used to in the fluff. So you have that kind of thing going on. Then also so Danny was talking about, I don't remember which empire it was you were talking about, Danny. The South Indian one. I can't remember the name.
The Punjab.
Yeah. And then you also got China lasted a long time. China, although it goes through multiple dynasties, it's still basically an empire. And It's still, you can make the argument it's still the same thing it is today. They just switched from an emperor to, Pooh Bear. And they have it's been around for thousands of years, but China never had a ton of colonies. The South Indian Empire you're talking about didn't have a ton of colonies.
No.
So is part of the issue with the Imperium, like you were saying, that it will eventually collapse like the British Empire. But the British Empire still got they literally fought a war to keep the Falkland Islands for some reason.
Yeah. In the 80s. Well, because it belonged to them. That's why. You keep what you belong. Listen, when talking about the cultural deviation, there's been times in the fluff where planets were separated from the rest of the Imperium by warp storms for thousands of years, and they had that cultural deviation. But the Imperium still came in, put their foot down essentially using Space Marines and Imperial Guard, and reasserted their control.
Right.
My tithe.
So no, I mean they do that. I mean they're capable of doing that. That's no different than the British putting down different colonial uprisings, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's the same thing. But again, it's unsustainable, especially the larger the scale is, right? There's just not. You're basically keep putting water on a grease fire, it might seem like it's putting stuff out, but you're really just spreading it around. And, I mean, I think it's just, again, the idea without that key figurehead that everyone rallies behind, that is a moving, living force within the Imperium, right? That unified vision for it, that also creates that fanatical belief, that also, again, kind of, creates these very clear pillars of cultural identity that everyone can bond to, that it's just not going to work. I mean, I think this is to the point of what John was making about, basically the 5,000 years of continuous Chinese culture. There's always been different dynasties. There's always been different rulers, but, with different policies in place, but like the culture remains relatively consistent because there are kind of built-in pillars that matter and that have never changed. And, Confucius being kind of the primary one, right? Like his teachings are still, again, it's one of those things of, in the Occidental tradition, we talk about Plato and Aristotle and all that, but like a lot of their ideas and a lot of what we use from them are very clearly like, yeah, these guys were really wrong. But that's not necessarily true in Chinese culture, where you can critique Confucius like that, right? There's still that kind of central pillar.
The Buddha.
Yeah, or Buddhism, or again, just general even if the names have changed, the concept of ancestor worship and the concept of the central, all of those things. So there's these really kind of foundational cultural structures that lead to the idea of kind of a unified order, generally centered around one or two people. So again, if the emperor's around and actually really around, it works. But without him, it's just you can't sustain empire.
You don't think maybe he and the Primarchs being gone actually function a little bit like what you're talking about, as like the cultural pillars that can kind of hold up the system, even no matter how rickety it gets? Like,
well, the emperor's trying his best.
Can still point to.
I mean, that's the point of like
it's corpse on the throne.
I mean, it's very Catholic, right? Like the history of the Catholic Church of this religion going around, kind of eating other religions, and kind of twisting them into, it's like, okay, here's my accepted variants. You're allowed, have fun. But I think
Christmas trees.
Yeah, exactly. Yule logs, Easter eggs, Christmas and winter for some reason, right?
It's only in the northern hemisphere.
Yeah. But
Australia
it's one
does
of those,
it right.
yeah, exactly. But it's just one of those things, I think, of even with that, like everyone knows the emperor, and that's a unifying thing, which is why I think the Imperium has survived 10,000 years without the emperor as a guiding living force. But not everyone really knows the Primarchs, right? Like that's the thing that's in the fluff, is that the average Imperial citizen actually doesn't know a shit ton about the Primarchs.
They know about being sanguineous.
Right, like Sanguinius is common because he's common in art, and this is very medieval, right? Where how do most people learn the Bible? They learn them from stained glass windows.
And there's also the festival of Sanguinala, where they celebrate him.
Sanguinius has his own holiday, basically.
And then on the just to clarify, I'm not going for or against anything you just said, but to clarify or add on to what you were just saying, like they have the statues of the Loyalist Primarchs, and they teach the stories of the Loyalist Primarchs. But what's interesting is in several cases, especially in the Inquisitor books, the Hollow Mountain, the ones regarding that Inquisitor, I forget his name. There's a point in time where he actually discovers when he's chasing a homunculi through the Imperial Palace. I guess we should put at the beginning of this that we're going to have spoilers, right?
I will, don't worry.
Sorry, just as a side note, that he sees 18 plinths instead of 9 plinths. Yeah. And he's like, wait a minute. I recognize those as Primarchs, but those guys look like Primarchs. What the hell? And then a custodian comes in and says, you need to come with me.
Excuse me, sir, you had a bad thought. We need to take your horse.
That and also the doors to the throne room, like a mile up, opened up, and the gold light comes through, and he's like, I was thinking about Primarchs, but now the Emperor. And the Emperor's like, yeah.
Well, then, most people don't know Horus is a Primarch. He's just the arch traitor, right? Like
exactly.
he's not.
Originally, they didn't even know there was a heresy.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Right. So there's a lot of times in
there's a lot of in the previous lore, a lot of information was quote unquote redacted or hidden or not spoken of. Maybe the High Lord and some Imperial commanders, especially Space Marines, they knew, And that's why you have the incidents with the Grey Knights where they would like sterilize a whole population, a whole planet, or killed Imperial Guard regiments because they helped them fight some demons or some Chaos Marines. And the average citizen will never meet a Space Marine.
No, not even a regular Space Marine, let alone a Chaos one.
Right.
Or
So
let
do
alone
you
a
think
Grey
that
Knight.
like the High Lords of Terra are like a good stand-in for Parliament?
Yeah, they kind of have to be. I mean, they have no. I know at one point during the Horus Heresy they did have the Senate, but that was dissolved during the Heresy. And I can't remember if they brought it back or not. I guess once they start talking about the Scouring, they'll mention that. But for now, anyway, the High Lords are probably the equivalent of Parliament. Maybe I don't know,
like a ruling
House of
council.
Lords.
Yeah.
Or they could be like maybe the House Lord or like the cabinet.
Yeah.
Prime Minister's cabinet. Like if you were stuck with just the cabinet to run things.
Yeah,
There's a great line about the High Lords of Terra in War of the Beasts where Vangaric, the mad assassin king, aka he's the master of the assassins before he decides to kill everybody. He has a line where he basically is thinking of like all the schemes and all the plotting and politics and self-serving that these people do, and he says to himself, at the end of the day, though, these people are only here because they're the most brutally ruthless and cunning and intelligent of anybody in their field. And as a result of that, they actually have to do their job to some degree. And if they're the best possible things, even doing their job at like a subpar level, not even full maximum effort, but like half effort, he's like, then things are going to be okay, at least in that regard. It's just everything else is annoying noise to me, but I actually have a question that maybe is worth considering. So if you assume, so we've been talking about, right, like, this is the Imperium, a viable form of government, and whether or not it can last. But we're also talking about something that's technically lasted 10,000 years. So 10 times longer than even Danny's example.
5 times longer.
1850. Yeah, there you go. Math is not good. I don't have Excel in front of me. Anywho, it's still insane, right? It's a long time.
No, I mean, that's mind-bogglingly long, seeing as like our own kind of written history only goes back, 6,000 years, right?
Yeah.
So
the question becomes, do we mean a viable form of government, like it technically should exist infinitely, and that should be the standard to which we hold it? Or is it more along the lines of it has to be way above and beyond even the human average for government, even if you scale that average into a galactic idea?
I more thought of viable as being like, is this something that I can realistically buy working? Like, I understand it's sci-fi or fantasy, and we suspend our disbelief to a certain extent, right?
To a great extent.
Hard time. Yeah, right. Like there's 9 foot tall super warriors.
No, that's not even that. That's somewhat believable. Is that, as we talked before and other places, it's the Titans, and like these giant machines can physically navigate a planet because every planet is made of solid bedrock for 3 miles down.
That's the big one for me, which has always been the big one for me.
I mean, Danny, I already had a hard time reading Titan novels. You just made it worse.
It's once you start thinking about it, it's really hard. So for me, for viable, I mean, like, is this something that literally could function this way? Like, I don't really know. And I guess Adam's analogy of the British Empire works in that, it took months or years to get places like the Immaterium does in the books, right? And you could get cut off, and the regional governors would have a lot of power and everything. But with such a large scope, like, how could you bureaucratically actually keep a track of enough stuff that it would actually function? And does it actually function? Like, I don't know if it actually functions. And like, you read the novels, and the novels are like, you read one of the Beckwin novels, or you read the Eisenhorn trilogy, or you read like these trilogies are like these grand sweeping stories. and they take place in like the course of like 150 years. And like they're like, yeah, so we went to like these 5 planets and rooted out heresy on 5 and 3 of them. And you're like, well, what about the 1 million other planets?
Yeah.
Like, how can this actually work? And how can something like the Inquisition or the High Lords actually keep track? And is it really just the regional governors that actually hold everything in line and they ask for help? And if they're lucky, a Space Marine chapter hears them? Like, it doesn't seem like it would actually work to me. It seems very far-fetched.
No, I don't. I mean, I think it's, actually logistically, it probably really doesn't. Although I guess the argument for that, why it can manage to work, is because there's still the Emperor's Tarot, right? Like, he's still capable of communicating with the High Lords and with other people.
Yeah.
So it's not like, again, if you're like a planetary government, we're like, oh my God, Tyranids are in our system. Like, we need reinforcements ASAP. You're not getting those for like 2 years. So you're probably dead unless a librarian or somebody was reading the tarot, right? And they're like, oh God, we need to be in the system like in a year, right? And there's like, you send out the distress call, and like, oh, we just happen to be coming through your cruising by, right?
Or some Ordo Xeno Inquisitor was tracking the tendril or something.
Right. So yeah, I don't think it's just because the distances are so mind-boggling. And I'm willing to say that had the Emperor actually succeeded in his grand ambition, it would work, because you'd have the webway, you have instantaneous travel, right? Like, that's safe and all that. Like, then it works. But without that, I just don't feasibly see it existing.
Well, and I suppose that's why the storyline is that it's all falling apart, right?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a slow decline.
Yeah.
Even with like Gilliman returning, it still is not working.
Yeah.
Like, you have probably the most logistically minded Primarch come back, and he's not able to hold it together.
I think in one of the books it mentions where Gulliman is having trouble trying to keep it all together. But Danny, you don't think that the Astronomicon is that binding tenant required to keep everything together, basically?
It definitely helps, but I don't think it's enough. Just because we see how, especially with the advent of 8th edition and the new fluff and the 2 Imperiums, that it is fallible, right? Like, it can be blocked by warp storms and et cetera, et cetera. So it's definitely not something that can be totally relied upon the entire time. I think that's the problem.
I think with the Imperium, it like John mentioned, it really heavily relies upon the Imperial governors to kind of hold the line until someone gets there. And like Danny said, I think the tarot helps, and there's been plenty of stories where it's a librarian who's doing his daily tarot reading, and he happens, hey, this thing's inverted. That means there's a planet nearby that needs help. Or it's the astropath that also has their tarot cards with them, and they have
this vision while in the warp.
Fishy. I only trust the runic bones that the runic priests
or the runic bones.
Or the Grey Knights have their the prognosticators, right? Like, like there's actually a whole lot. Like, there's a whole lot of the kind of militant arm of the Imperium that's dedicated to, like, we need to know when threats are before they happen.
So
right?
I mean, even Tigris
get to them.
Yeah, because even in I think it's Dark Imperium. No, it's the book with Fall Acadia, or the one with the Rise of the Primarch. There it is, Rise of the Primarch. When that was all happening, Tigerius had the visions, things like that, which is why he trusted Call and Yvraine, or the Eldar, to bring him back or to do whatever they needed to do. He had no issues trusting them because of his visions. So I think there's a portion of the librarians that's probably all they do. And that's the only way to get a jump on it and to help keep things together.
This also all reminds me of, there's a passage in The Hollow Mountain. I'm pretty sure it's this one of the 2 novels that have been out for this Inquisitor. We cannot remember, but he goes undercover to the shipwright housing, basically the rogue trader of all rogue trader buildings, and it's this massive dock and this massive spaceport, and I think there's this huge holographic display of basically the galaxy and plot charts for major trade lanes and like, estimations and this and that. And there's like scribes on scribes on scribes on scribes just tracking all this information in detail. And I feel like a lot of this that we're forgetting is that there's so much menial and essentially slave labor that goes into making a lot of this thing function, just like on just massive scale.
Liberate servitors.
Yeah, I know, right? But what's interesting is that storyline, because it's in 40K, they make that storyline take place the same time that the Dark Imperium storyline takes place. And I don't mean the one with Gilliman after the fact, but where it leads up to Gilliman's return. And so when he's escaping, part of the reason he's able to escape is because all of a sudden people stopped getting relay feeds, and apparently it was something to the tune of every 15 minutes to an hour they'd get pings from navigators knowing, oh, okay, these lanes are still good. And that's how they'd know to send Imperial Guard fleets out. If they'd send like 1 or 2 rogue trader fleets out there, and they'd get pings up to a certain point and then stop, and they'd be like, all right, send an expedition fleet, go see what the shit's going on over there.
I mean, that makes sense.
But the reason why he's able to escape is because there's all of a sudden see this panic where literally he describes it as like half the map. And as the reader, you're like, oh, it's the Citrix Maledictum. It's that big bad thing that 9th edition and 8th edition brought. Oh God, that's so cool. But anyway, like everyone just starts freaking the shit out. And like half the map goes dark and people are panicking. And he's like, I'm going to go over here because I was arrested just now, but no, I'm not.
So I guess to try to kind of wrap it up, what could you see as being the thing that could bring it either into line to be more realistic or more viable or something that would last? So like you got Gilliman back, right?
Right.
Like if you got the other great strategist Primarchs back, like Dorn and the Lion, or like Russ comes back and starts executing all the Chaos Space Marines he can find, right? Like get his hands on. What could that potentially, in the fluff, stabilize the Imperium like what the Emperor wanted, or is it just too far gone and it's just a slow decline into terrible?
I don't know if it's what the Emperor would have wanted if you even get 2 or 3 Primarchs back, but I do know I do think it would stabilize. It would stabilize into what it is, and it would forever be on this plateau of just it never gets better and it never gets worse. And just
even though like Gilliman is like totally fine with people like Call trying to advance technology again and stuff.
Well, I mean, but he's like not fine with it, but he's just one of those like, just don't tell me you're doing it, but do it. I mean,
yeah. Don't tell me you're creating a new breed of Space Marines, but create a new breed of Space Marines.
That's because that's like, I mean, and you totally see that when he's like, Cal's like, oh, I've got the other 9 Legion Primaris ready to go. And Gilman's like, never let them offline. He's like, oh, should I kill them? I'm going to change the topic and you're not going to ask me that question.
Yes. I remember that conversation.
Because Gilliman is basically like, I like having back pockets.
Well, that's a waste of good resources.
Oh yeah.
Other 9 is in the traders.
Yeah, he has the Call has the trader Primaris in stasis right now. So
cool. So that's how we're going to get Primaris Chaos Marines.
So I don't know
either that or what's his name, the spider dude.
Fabius Bile.
Yeah,
Fabius Bile just probably steals the Primaris from Call.
Well, he's already has captured Primaris Marines, so
yeah,
right.
So he did that.
I think it would take more than just the Primarchs, and I think it all hinges on the Blackstone that Necrons use, because the Necrons use the Blackstone. One of the reasons why you got the Citrix Maledictum was because Abaddon was going around destroying all the pylons, and the pylons. Right. What the pylons did was basically keep chaos in check.
Yeah,
keep the Eye of Terror in check. And if they're able to somehow get enough Blackstone or rebuild those pylons or make even more, possibly, they could seal it back up. If they're able to do that, then things get better. If it's just the Primarchs coming back, I think it's still a slide because you still have half the Imperium out of contact with the rest of the Imperium.
You could always have Russ resurrected on the other side and he just makes his own kingdom.
Yeah.
Well, there's Blood Angels, so we may have some come back.
Yeah, I think I think short of Big E coming back, you can't save the Imperium in its current form. I do think if you got enough Primarchs back and they kind of rallied back to Terra and kind of worked on like how do we rebuild the Imperium, basically have the Great Crusade 2.0 after kind of abandoning the rest of the Imperium for several thousand years, so they can rebuild their strength and like develop like counter warp technology like the Blackstone to be able to like actually shut down warp storms and open up warp travel safely again. Like I think then, is it the Imperium? No, it's probably something very different.
It would have to become something different.
Yeah. But it's essentially, humanity isn't gone. It's just the Imperium shatters, and then you have a new empire slowly build out of it. If you've got the Primarchs back, and they all make the decision of we are going to abandon half the Imperium and concentrate everything we have into actually rebuilding what we can defend. Right.
And it would end up being, if you think about it, it would end up being a bunch of mini Imperiums that are all defined by their own cultural traits that flow from the Primarchs, right? Because in the same way, the people under there, the Space Marines are going to be themselves regardless. But then you get the humans who are going to follow the flavor of the people above them, like they did on their original planet homeworlds.
Yeah, I mean, the closest analog would probably be like the fall of Rome to eventually like the Renaissance Italian city-states, this kind of like loose coalition of, kind of distinct bodies that can still, when combined together, have a pretty outsized influence.
Yeah.
In the region.
Don't swing that outsized influence in any way that makes anything remarkable.
Yeah. Well, I feel like the Imperium would do that just because if anything, Russ would get bored and be like, I need to go kill some things.
Well, that's how you get the Crazy Crusade, the fourth one, right?
Yeah. But, I think that really the only way to save the Imperium, I think by the old
Russ,
logic.
you're attacking an imperial city. Yeah, they looked at me funny.
Yeah. They were traitors. It's fine. I think the only way to truly save the Imperium the way it is, in the way the world has been built so far, is to have the Emperor return, like physically. Yeah. Right, to actually come back and, and then, because then you've got Big E, and they don't have, and the Chaos doesn't have Horus, right? So, they're going to have to suddenly they're on the defensive because you've got basically God guiding the Imperium, right? And I think that's kind of something you need to keep trillions of souls in line, right, into one unified government. I think it takes a literal godlike effort to do that. But if left to mortal plans, it's not going to work.
But that might be something Games Workshop may just never do.
No, I mean that would be so.
They have no reason to. Really?
I mean, yeah, if people thought Primaris were bad, the idea of like, oh, if the Emperor's back and here you go, it would just be like,
The storyline, I think, has only technically progressed 150 years, which in the scale of the storyline that they've already had and the suspension of belief that's accepted, it's like a drop in the bucket. Not that much.
All right. Well, I think that was a good discussion we had on the
final
viability of the Imperium. I think that like ultimately it's not like viable as in like it probably doesn't function, which I guess it doesn't really function in the fluff as it is, right? But it's also not entirely like the British Empire. But I think it's culturally, it's not too much like the British Empire. Like I don't feel like the Brits really pushed their culture onto others. There was more like a, hey, we're here, and if you assimilate, great. And if you don't assimilate, whatever. We're still going to work you to the bone, right?
Well, that would be more like the Spanish culture.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Ultimately, I guess the historical references kind of work in many ways, but then also because it's a giant fantasy sci-fi setting.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's a work of fiction, but no, it's an interesting thought experiment too. And when you look at its historical parallels that they clearly took inspiration from when building the universe, right?
Right.
Because it's hard not to look at the Inquisition and not be like, oh, yeah.
Yep.
I have no idea what they could have referenced. I mean, that seemed completely new to me.
Yeah, exactly. The Ordos.
Yeah.
The Black Templars, who are constantly on crusade. Yep. I have no idea where that came from.
Nope, not at all.
No. All right. Well, thanks for joining us. And next time, we're going to discuss some real heresy.
Some real heresy.
We hope you've enjoyed this episode of Pod Save the Imperium. Be sure to check us out on the various social medias, such as Facebook and Instagram. And coming soon, we'll have other areas for you to check us out and follow along. So stay tuned for more episodes.